Hello, I'm Richard Ritter. I'm a lecturer in the School of English here at the University of Leeds, and today I'm going to be talking about Jane Austen and her novel Mansfield Park from 1814. In particular, I'm going to be asking you to think about how we, as modern readers, might approach this novel. When we read, we often think about the things that an author is trying to tell us. We look for ideas, messages, and agendas that writers are conveying throughout their works. In this lecture, I want to think about how we might respond to one of the things that Austen's novel doesn't say out loud, but which is nevertheless present, and that's the issue of slavery. The presence of slavery in Mansfield Park has attracted a lot of critical debate. Much of it stems around a brief moment in the text where two of the main characters, Edmund Bertram and Fanny Price, are discussing a conversation they had had the previous evening. And Fanny Price recalls asking her uncle a question about the slave trade. But rather than initiating a discussion of the subject, it produces only a dead silence. I'll read this passage out. It begins with Fanny Price discussing her increasing willingness to talk to her uncle. So she says, "But I do talk to him more than I used. I'm sure I do. Did you not hear me ask him about the slave trade last night?" "I did, and was in hopes that the question would be followed up by others. It would have pleased your uncle to be inquired of further." And then Fanny concludes this passage by saying, "And I longed to do it, but there was such a dead silence." As I'll suggest in a moment, there are numerous, although frequently veiled, allusions to slavery throughout Mansfield Park, although none are as explicit as this one. And yet, rather than initiate a discussion of it, Austen presents her readers with a brief glimpse of the subject, only to turn away again, to close it down, and perhaps to impose her own silence upon this subject. The question we have to ask is, how do we interpret this silence? Is it just an absence of meaning, or might it be more nuanced, something we can interrogate and extract meaning from? Within the narrative of the novel itself, we could ask, is this silence a sign of guilt on behalf of the Bertram family? Is slavery the elephant in the room that they're anxious to not discuss? Or perhaps their unwillingness to talk about the slave trade is just indicative of a lack of interest, boredom or indifference, which perhaps implies that Austen is making a point about the morality of these characters, their lack of compassion. But then we can take a step back and we can question Austen's silence in this case. Does she as a writer have an obligation to discuss slavery? Is the silence that she imposes on the subject indicative of complicity with the slave trade, or might it suggest the beginnings of a critique of it? I'll be thinking about some of these questions throughout the lecture, but I also want to think about how we as readers can equip ourselves to interpret these moments of silence. I'd like to suggest a form of literary criticism that places Austen's work within its historical and literary context. If we're going to discern meanings from these moments of silence, we need to think about Austen in relation to the period in which she was writing, and in particular in relation to her contemporaries, authors who, unlike Austen, have maybe fallen out of favour today or have been forgotten by the general public. And throughout the lecture, I'll also be looking at some modern critics to see what they have to say about Austen and to think about how they might construct an image of her as a politically engaged writer. Now that might sound like a surprising or a challenging view of Austen. I think quite often, and certainly within popular culture, we tend to think of Austen as an author who appeals to us on the grounds of nostalgia. She presents an unchanging moment in history, unaffected by politics. It appeals to our nostalgia for an unchanging past. Such accounts of Austen often derive from a misreading of one of her most famous pronouncements on her novelistic technique. This comes in a letter to her nephew, where Austen responds to the news that some chapters of a book that he was writing have gone missing. Austen playfully expresses relief that she wasn't around at the time, so she can't be accused of having stolen the chapters. She then goes on to reflect. "I do not think, however, that any theft of that sort would really be very useful to me. What should I do with your strong, manly, spirited sketches full of variety and glow? How could I possibly join them on to the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as produces little effect after much labour? If we take this at face value, it's possible to construct an image of Austen as a painter of miniatures, employed with composing detailed but essentially narrow, bounded pictures of life. This, Austen appears to suggest, is a feminine mode of writing, in contrast to the strong, manly, spirited sketches of her nephew. Here, then, is evidence that Austen isn't interested in the wider political world, but with a vision of life insulated from the political turmoil of the period. Or it would be, except for the fact that Austen isn't being entirely serious here. She's being very facetious in her self-deprecation. We know from her spirited defence of novels in Northanger Abbey, for instance, that Austen values highly the work of women writers. She sees them as culturally significant, rather than a diminished second best to the work of men. Moreover, the letter itself from which this quotation comes is full of ironic twists and turns. To try and draw a kind of manifesto for Austen's style based upon this single letter would be ridiculous. And even if we accept this metaphor of Austen's novel as a piece of ivory 2 inches wide, we're constantly being drawn to what might lie beyond the confines of this narrow canvas. The moment of silence with which I began seems suddenly, and perhaps unnervingly, to insist that we look to the margins of the text and consider what might exist beyond them. This isn't necessarily a case of reading Austen against the grain. By introducing moments like the dead silence in Mansfield Park, only to close them back down, Austen draws our attention to absences that remain uneasily present within her fiction. And for an author who grew up in such a turbulent period of British history, it's not unreasonable to expect that political events have left their mark upon her work. Because we shouldn't forget that Austen did live through a tumultuous period of British history. For much of her lifetime, Britain was at war with France. Indeed, her brothers served in the Navy. And there was also social unrest at home in Britain. People were agitating for political reform, for greater democratic and civil rights. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, the politically engaged nature of Austen's writing hasn't always been recognised. It was not really until the 1970s that books about Austen began to think of her in her historical context. Perhaps the most important contribution to this strand of criticism was a book from 1975, Marilyn Butler's Jane Austen and the War of Ideas. Butler's real achievement in this book is to place Austen within her historical and literary context. The picture she paints of Austen is of a conservative novelist who was intellectually orthodox, but her true innovation, Butler argues, lies in her ability to make her politics covert within her novels, that is, buried or hidden or latent. I'll read a brief section. The crucial action of her novels is in itself expressive of the conservative side in an active war of ideas. Jane Austen believes, as her conservative contemporaries believe. Her feat is to have found so discreet a way of saying it. Technically, the striking thing about her novels is that they do not mention the French Revolution and barely allude to the Napoleonic Wars. So Butler's view of Austen evokes not silence, but discretion. For her, Austen may not comment directly on political matters, but they appear in encoded ways within her work nonetheless. Butler promotes a way of reading Austen which places her work within its historical and literary context. And the context I'm thinking about now is slavery within the novel Mansfield Park. For much of Austen's lifetime, slavery was a fact of life. Much of Britain's wealth depended upon the trade and forced labour of African slaves. Most typically, these slaves would be taken from Africa, transported across the Atlantic, where they were then sold to plantation owners in the Americas and the Caribbean. in return for the products of the plantations, things like sugar, tobacco, coffee, alcohol, which were then brought back to Europe. So it's slave labour that lies behind the origins of these seemingly innocuous and ordinary commodities. In this way, slavery was an entrenched, if distant, or sometimes barely visible part of everyday life. In the case of the Austens, we also know that her father, the Reverend George Austen, was a trustee of a plantation in Antigua. And Antigua is an island in the West Indies, which in Austen's time was a British colony where sugar was grown. This is really significant for us because Antigua also features in Mansfield Park. Throughout the novel, Austen doesn't write directly about slavery, but she makes it clear that the wealth of Mansfield Park, the wealth of the Bertram family, is maintained by the proceeds of a sugar plantation in Antigua. And this is a plantation that would have been worked by African slaves. In the early chapters of the novel, we hear Mrs. Norris, Fanny Price's annoying aunt, and Lady Bertram discussing the financial problems that the estate has been experiencing. Mrs. Norris says, "Why, you know Sir Thomas's means will be rather straitened if the Antigua estate is to make such poor returns." And Lady Bertram replies, "Oh, that will soon be settled. Sir Thomas has been writing about it, I know." And it's these problems, whatever they are, that later makes it expedient, as the narrator says, for Sir Thomas to leave England and to visit his estate in Antigua to arrange his affairs. Critics have speculated on why Sir Thomas feels it necessary to visit his estate in Antigua. If we bear the historical context in mind, there are two possible causes. On the one hand, this was a period in which slave rebellions were not uncommon. It's possible Sir Thomas was travelling to the West Indies to quell a rebellion, to re-establish order. On the other hand, Sir Thomas might have been going to ensure the well-being of his African slaves. This isn't necessarily a sudden humanitarian impulse, but rather a response to the abolition of the slave trade, which had happened in 1807, 7 years before the publication of Mansfield Park. This was decreed by an Act of Parliament, but although it made it illegal to trade slaves, it didn't abolish slavery itself within the British colonies. But because it's no longer possible to trade slaves to places like Antigua, it meant that landowners had to ensure the survival of their existing slaves. And often this meant travelling to the estate to ensure that the overseers, the employers who look after the estate in their absence, to ensure that these overseers weren't mistreating the slaves or handling them with violence or brutality. Given this information, are we any closer to understanding why, when Fanny Price asks a question about the slave trade, she is greeted with a dead silence? Is it because the Bertram family don't want to acknowledge that their wealth, their comfort, the ease of their life is funded by the appalling barbarity of the slave trade? Perhaps. But if we read on with that particular passage, we get a slightly different picture. Fanny Price takes pleasure in hearing about the slave trade. So she says that she longed to ask her uncle, but there was such a dead silence. And then she continues, "And while my cousins were sitting by without speaking a word, or seemingly at all interested in the subject, I thought it would appear as if I wanted to set myself off at their expense, by showing a curiosity and pleasure in his information, which he must wish his own daughters to feel." If we accept that Sir Thomas might want to improve the condition of the slaves on his Antiguan estate, it would appear that Fanny wants to hear about it. It would have pleased her uncle to discuss the improvements he has made. From this perspective, the uncomfortable dead silence stems from the fact that Sir Thomas's daughters have got no interest at all in the welfare of these slaves. They reveal themselves to be lacking in the kind of compassion that characterises Fanny Price. But this is still an uncomfortable position for us as modern readers to be in, as it doesn't challenge the institution of slavery itself. Perhaps from our early 21st century perspective, we want to believe that Austen is on our side. We want to assume that she shares our politics, We want her to be arguing for the immorality of slavery itself, rather than drawing attention to the temporary good afforded by improvements in the conditions of slaves. This raises an interesting, a very difficult question. To what extent should we, as modern readers, impose our own ethical framework on this or any other historical text?